everyone, and welcome to Solomon's Cave. Before we get into Thales' life and philosophy, it is helpful to have a quick look at where Thales is from, namely Miletus. Miletus was a coastal city on the western coast of Anatolia, what is nowadays Turkey. Right there, where the little red square is. Miletus was an important city in the region that was known as Ionia. Ionia and other nearby regions on the west coast of Anatolia had been colonized by the Greeks a few centuries before Thales. Besides Miletus, other famous cities in the region of Ionia were Ephesus and Smyrna. Now I say that Miletus was an important coastal city, because if we look at this map, we can see that over the course of several centuries, the harbor of Miletus was basically doomed to be filled up with sediment. As you can see, by late antiquity, which by the way was much later than Thales, but by late antiquity was more or less the last era of Miletus as a coastal city. However, at the time of Thales, it was a thriving port city, and it was part of one of the busiest shipping routes of antiquity. Many of the ships that were going between Greece and Anatolia stopped in Miletus, so it was an important harbor in the whole eastern Mediterranean, connecting places like Egypt, Lebanon, Cyprus, and of course Greece. Now that we know where Thales lived, let's look at who he was. Thales is known as a man of firsts. In the Western tradition, Thales was the first philosopher, but he was not just a philosopher, he was much more than that. He is often seen as the first Western astronomer, the first scientist, and the first Greek mathematician. However, we do have a little problem when it comes to Thales. And this is actually a familiar problem when it comes to people from the distant past. And that is that we don't have any of his books. Nor do we have first or second-hand accounts of his sayings or his actions. All we have are a few stories and a few sayings from much later, including scattered references over the works of Plato, Aristotle, Herodotus, and a few others. So since those are the only ones we have no choice but to use them. But we also have to be cautious and not immediately believe everything they wrote about him. One source that talks about Thales is Herodotus, who wrote about a full century after Thales. According to him, Thales was of Phoenician descent, and he was a politically active figure who argued that all Greek city-states and Ionia should unite. And apparently Thales was also a military leader who showed some true ingenuity when leading an army to the east. As Herodotus describes it, he was leading an army and at some point he had to cross a river. But there was a problem. There were no bridges over the river. They didn't carry any boats with them, and the river was too deep to walk through. So he made his army camp on the riverbanks. He then instructed some of his men to start digging a channel behind the camp that would divert half of the water away from the main stream and through the channel behind the camp. And the army could now walk through it to the other side. On their way back from the war, the channel was still there, and they could cross both the river and the channel on foot. Now before we get deep into Thales' philosophy, let's look at two funny stories about Thales that probably didn't really happen, but they are funny nonetheless. The first one is a story that comes from Plato. He tells us that one day, as Thales was doing astronomy, he looked upward and fell into a well because he wasn't paying attention. Then a serving girl from Thrace, that is northern Greece, came by and made fun of him. The second story comes from Aristotle. He tells us that Thales was mocked for being poor. Thales, in response, used his scientific insight into nature to predict a large olive harvest. So he invested heavily in olive presses. By the time the harvest came in, he owned the majority of all the olive presses and was able to make a fortune, #monopoly. So he proved that he could be rich if he wanted to, and that philosophy was not a useless practice after all. These two stories show us two sides of philosophers in general and how they were seen in the ancient world. On the one hand, they were kind of like funny or silly people that were often a little bit out of touch with reality. But on the other hand, they were also brilliant people that could use their mind to achieve great things that were impossible without a clear insight into the world and how it works. So they should not be underestimated. Besides that, we know that Thales was interested in mathematics and geometry. In fact, Herodotus reports that Thales accurately predicted the solar eclipse that occurred on the 28th of May in 585 BC. Thales' main contribution to philosophy, however, was his search for the Arche. The Arche, yeah. Well, Arche in this context can perhaps best be understood as the primordial substance of the world, or perhaps the arch material, or maybe just the word stuff, just the stuff that the universe is made of. He believed that ultimately, if you break down everything into the tiniest possible pieces, everything was deep down made of the very same stuff. This is essentially the same question that scientists today are still trying to answer. For example, at CERN in Switzerland, where they built the super collider. What they're trying to do is smash really small particles together at close to the speed of light in order to find out what the universe is really made of. Now, Thales didn't have a super collider. All he had was his mind and his observations. So in order to find out what the Arche really is, Thales set out to formulate the rules for finding the Arche. According to him, the Arche had to explain 4 things. The first thing it had to explain was existence. It had to explain why anything exists, and it had to have the cause and ground for existence in itself. 2. It had to explain change. In this world, things are constantly changing their form or shape. Things grow and shrink, so the Arche had to be the cause of change as well. 3rd, the Arche had to explain motion. Besides changing from one thing into another, things also change from one place to another. So motion had to be explained by the Arche. And 4th, the Arche had to explain life. Though some things are dead, other things are definitely not. They are alive. Plants and animals alike live, and their life had to be explained by the Arche. If there were any substance in the world that could account for these 4 criteria, existence, change, motion and life, that then was the best candidate for being the Arche. And the answer that Thales ultimately gave was... Are you ready for this? Water! It seems strange for us. I mean, why would water be the Arche of everything? But let's think about it a little more. First of all, Thales observed that everything that exists in one of 3 states. It's either a solid, a liquid, or a gas. And water actually occurs in all 3 forms. Solid water is ice, liquid water is water, and gaseous water is mist. So water could explain existence as it had all 3 forms of existence in itself. It is perhaps in relation to this particular point that one of the few surviving quotes of Thales must be understood. He said that the world floats on water. That makes sense to the degree that whatever supported the world must be water of some sort. Later, his student Anaximander, see the next video on Greek philosophy, speculated that rocks were a form of super hard frozen water and that air not mist or damp, but air itself, is a super vaporized form of water. Next up is change. How does water explain change? Well, it can be observed that water can change its form by itself. Water can evaporate even if no one heats up the water. It can also freeze or melt by itself. And of course, water can condensate by itself on any surface. Hence, water has the internal capacity to change its form, so it can explain change. And water can also explain motion, because water moves by itself. If you don't believe me, just go to the ocean and look at the waves. No one is pushing or pulling the waves. The waves come and go all by themselves. Or at least that anyone can see. And the water in rivers and streams is also constantly in motion. Hence, water can move by itself and thus can be the cause of motion as well. And finally, does water explain life? Well, not at first sight, but all life, whether it's humans or animals or plants, need water. And without water, everything dies. This was an observation made by Aristotle as well. So, yes, I guess water can also explain life, because without water, life does not exist. So to summarize, the Arche has to explain existence, change, motion, and life. And water has the intrinsic capacity of existence, change, motion, and life. So the Arche is actually water. In the next video, we will look at Thales' student Anaximander, and we will discover what he has to say about the Arche. If you liked the video, please give us a like, and then share and subscribe to this channel for more videos.